In processing, when you want to draw a curve, you have your choice of two different kinds of curves. In previous videos, we discussed Catmull-Rom curves, which are an easy and flexible form of curve. Starting with this video, we'll look at a second, different form of curves called Bezier curves. The name comes from Pierre Bezier, who popularized the mathematics behind this kind of curve. You're already familiar with Bezier curves if you've ever used a drawing program like Photoshop or Illustrator. Every time you draw a curve with one of those programs, you're drawing a Bezier curve. Before we get into the mechanics of creating and drawing these things in processing, let's see what they can do. Here's a single closed Bezier curve. You can see that it's made up out of a bunch of points, and that there are two different kinds of points. Some are drawn here with open circles, and those points lie on the curve. Coming out of every open circle are a couple of lines, with closed circles on the ends. We often call the open circles knots, and the closed circles handles. If I grab one of the knots and move it around, you can see that the curve moves with me. So the curve always goes through the knots. The direction of the curve is controlled by the handles. So as I change the length of the handles, I'm changing how much they influence the shape of the curve at that knot. And I can move around any of these things. One of the really fun things about Bezier curves is that they have a tremendous variety of shapes that they can take on. Let me show you something that you can do with a Bezier curve that you really can't do with a Catmull-Rom curve using just a small number of points. I'm going to grab this handle and flip it around, and now we have a loop. Bezier curves have no trouble making these kinds of loops. You can certainly create this kind of picture with a Catmull-Rom curve, but you'd need to use many more control points. So let's just sort of move these around and see what the thing looks like. I can make another loop over here, so I can make these kinds of twisty, bendy shapes. So Bezier curves offer us a lot of flexibility in designing and creating our shapes. This is a closed curve, but we can also make an open curve. Here I've opened the curve up, and tell you what, I'll separate the points so we can really see them, and I'll get rid of the loops so things are really clear, and you can see that the curve now is not connected, it's an open curve, but the handles still control the shape of the curve as it comes out of the control points, and this is true at both ends. So I can really shape the nature of this curve by pulling these control points around. And I can make something like, well, very roughly, like a vase lying on its side just by pulling these control points out and make it look like the vase has got a big opening at its top. I can even round those things off a little bit and make them softer. And then we have something more like a jug, again, on its side. Like Catmull-Rom curves, we can look at the individual segments of this big curve. So let's look at just one Bezier segment. Here's a single Bezier segment. It's made up out of 4 points, just like a Catmull-Rom curve, but we use these 4 points in a very different way. When we hand these 4 points to processing, first we hand it one of the endpoints and the handle associated with that endpoint. Then we hand it the second handle, and finally the last point. So the order of the points are 1, 2, 3, and 4. With those 4 points, processing will draw the curve that they create. So let me pull these points together a little bit to show you the variety of curves that we can get just from a single segment. So if these control points are close to each other and very long, we can get this long pointy thing. If I pull it down, I can get this very asymmetrical bendy shape. But even more fun is if I bring this thing around, I can create a loop. Now this is something that Catmull-Rom curves just can't do with a single segment. But a single segment of Bezier curve has no trouble making a loop like this. Another really cool thing that you can do with Bezier curves is you can make S shapes. So I'll tell you what, let's bring that one down here and this one over here. Tell you what, I'll go this way so it actually has the shape of a letter S as we're used to it. And you can see what's going on. The curve begins at the top, going to the left, then it swings down, and if I pull these out a little bit more, you can see it even goes to the right, and then it ends up going to the left again. So this S shape is no trouble for a single Bezier segment. 4 points make this S shape. So this is just an example of the rich variety of shapes that we can get out of Bezier curves. In fact, we can even make them kind of pointy. Notice how asymmetrical this is. This is another one of the great things about Bezier curves is they can have this terrific asymmetry inside of them. I can actually make this curve look like it has a little bit of a point. Let's bring these two things very close together. There we are. If I go too far, we get the loop. But if I just back off before the loop appears, we can get what looks like a sharp point. Now, it's not really a sharp point. It's just a very, very tight curve, but it sure looks like a sharp point. So by changing these handles, we can go from a nice roundy curve to a sharper and sharper curve to something that looks like it's coming to really a point, and then further on, building a nice big loop out of it. Let's take a look at how to build our old friend the heart out of Bezier curves. Here's our heart, and I'm going to draw this with just 4 Bezier curves. I'll start with a knot right at the top of the heart, and I'll shape the curve coming out of that point with a handle going up and to the left. Let's call these points A and B. The other 2 points of the curve will be off on the left, and they will bring the curve down to about the middle of the left side of the heart. So let's connect these with a line to show that they're together, and I'm going to call these points C and D. So when I ask processing to draw the curve, I hand it the points A, B, C, and D. Of course, all of these circles and lines and letters are just visual aids to help us see where the curve is going to go. So there's one more thing that sometimes helps us imagine where the curve is going to go, and that's to join points B and C with another imaginary line. Now we have sort of a little cage, sometimes also called the hull, for the curve. And the curve will be drawn inside this cage. So if I now hand the points A, B, C, and D to processing, we get the upper left lobe of the heart. Now let's draw the lower left part. So I'll create a new knot with a handle. We'll call them points A and B. At the bottom of the heart, I'll create another knot with a handle. I'll call those points C and D. And like before, I'll join B and C with another imaginary line. You can look at this series of 3 lines like a little zigzag, a little lightning bolt. And the Bezier curve is going to be a smooth version of that zigzag. Here it is, and notice that it has that very pleasing S shape. We were able to get that whole S with just 1 Bezier curve. Well, of course, we can do the very same thing on the right-hand side, so let's do that. Create a couple of points A and B. We'll create another couple of points C and D. I'll join B and C, and now the curve will be drawn inside that shell. So here we are, and as always, it's a smoothed version of that little shell. Finally, let's handle the S shape in the bottom right. I'll create a knot with a handle. We'll call them A and B. At the end of the curve, there'll be another knot and a handle. There are C and D. I'll join B and C with a little line. Here's our zigzag, and the Bezier curve is a smooth version of that zigzag. So here's our heart, drawn with only 4 Bezier curves. Of course, just like Catmull-Rom curves, we can find points on the Bezier curve. So we can use that curve as the path for an object that moves, creating motion and animation. In the next few videos, we'll look at the technique for creating, drawing, and manipulating Bezier curves.